Okay, well, good morning and welcome to the session on Northern Northwest Coast art history. For those of you that stayed last night at the community house till the very end, it was a very late night, actually a very early morning. I think we didn't get out of there until about 2 a.m. or a little after, so it's nice to see some of you that I saw walking out here this morning too. There are a couple changes to this session, the first being that I am not Barbara Brotherton, so if you were expecting her, I hope you're not too disappointed. My name is Anna Strengthman, and I also work at the Seattle Art Museum with Barbara. She was unable to come, so I'm taking her place. The second change is that Steve Brown is not here, so he will not be presenting his paper. But in his place, due to the scheduling change yesterday at the Warriors session, Ashley Verplank will be presenting on the Tlingit daggers. So our first speaker is Aldona Jonaitis, who is the director of the Museum of the North at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. Most recently, her book, The Art of the Northwest Coast, is that the right title? Is now being used as a textbook in classes at the university, which is very exciting. But today she's here to talk about 5 contemporary Tlingit artists, and I'll let her introduce them for you. Here's Aldona Jonaitis.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and I have to say congratulations for all of you being here at this ungodly hour on Sunday morning. So thank you, thank you. I'm very honored that you're all here. And actually, it's very interesting. This is the first time that the contemporary has been first. So we go from the most recent in the session, from the most recent to the most ancient. So I think that's just a fascinating way of organizing things. And since this represents a completely new area of research for me, I've never had such a hard time putting together a paper, so I apologize completely. I was really finishing it up this morning, so it's not what I do. Okay. Over the years, there have been 2 basic modes of interpreting Northwest Coast art. One is the formal and one is the iconographic. The first deals with how artworks look, and the other with what they mean. As I began to think about a talk that featured 5 innovative Tlingit artists, I realized that their works can be understood from one or the other perspectives. In the following talk, I'll focus on the form of one artist and the meaning of the other 4. I will argue that despite appearances, these artists are not so distant from their Tlingit artistic roots. It is noteworthy, by the way, that each one actually does belong to an artistic lineage. And I am sorry, Tanis, I always bungle your last name. Tanis S'eiltin? Is that okay? S'eiltin, okay. S'eiltin, she said. Yes? Really? Oh, I'll... Is that the microphone or me? Okay, well, in that case, sure. Actually, I could talk real loud because I'm from New York. Tanis' mother, Marie Miller, was a sewer, skin sewer, beater, and chilkat weaver. Larry McNeil is Nathan Jackson's cousin. Nick Galanin is Dave Galanin's son and Will Burkhart's nephew. Dakaheen Maynor is McNeil's nephew, and Stephen Jackson is Nathan Jackson's son. So I'll start off with something that's not Northwest Coast. There are many contemporary Native American and Native Canadian artists, such as Cherokee K. Walking Stick, whose artwork you see on the screen right now. Oh, wait. Thanks. Cree and Shoshone, John Quick to See Smith. And Cree, Gerald McMaster. There we are. In 1999, McMaster addressed the relationship he and his innovative Native art colleagues had with traditions, not just their own, but those in which they lived. And I quote, "Artists borrow from everywhere. They look at ancient images, forms, techniques with an understanding that what their ancestors had to say continues to have meaning to them, to us all, in the present. None of them wishes to believe they are located in some mythic past. Instead, they understand their realities as energetic practices of today, which offer them an unparalleled ranges in which to express themselves." And what do contemporary Native artists express with their images? Some speculate on what it means to be a Native person in today's world. Others make political or social statements, and there are those who use their art to express spiritual connections. Artists working in innovative or experimental modes today sometimes address all these issues in various depths. Northwest Coast art, perhaps more than any other tradition of art in Native North America, identifies itself strongly with earlier artistic traditions. Carvers make masks that have 19th century prototypes. Weavers create robes equal in quality and design to classic Chilkat robes. Totem poles stand proudly in native villages as well as all around the world. Their image is clearly based on beings that populated monumental carvings of earlier times. Since Northwest Coast ceremonialism continues to play active roles in many communities, there exists a considerable motivation to make the regalia correctly. In addition, the market that developed in the 1960s for contemporary Northwest Coast art places a high premium on creations that uncompromisingly draw from the past. And there's wonderful examples of such traditions that we even saw last night. As a result, many Northwest Coast Native artists create what is labeled, quote-unquote, traditional art, only taking small steps into the realm of what we might call the truly innovative. Some artists have indeed experimented with form, line, style. Robert Davidson is probably one of the best examples. Next. One Tlingit artist who experimented in a similar way was Tlingit James Chopard. In many of his carved wooden panels, Chopard breaks up the form line elements, rearranging them on the surface, taking advantage of the power of the forms, not only as components of complete images, but as dynamic visuals in their own right. Chopard explained the meaning behind these works. The broken up pieces signify the destruction of culture during colonialization. Their organization into a cohesive whole, like this piece, declares how successfully that culture has persisted despite generations of discrimination, mistreatment, and disease. Other contemporary Tlingit artists who experiment with traditional forms include Clarissa Hudson, who breaks up form line patterns in her paintings to create dreamlike images of intersecting Northwest Coast beings whose parts merge into one another. Preston Singletary, who creates stunning works in an untraditional medium of glass. And weaver Teri Rofkar, who uses ancient motifs and techniques to create subtle yet genuinely innovative raven's tails weavings. I mentioned at the beginning that I was going to discuss one artist whose formal innovations have created quite a stir, and that would be Stephen Jackson. He has produced relatively conventional large-scale carvings, including totem poles, as well as highly inventive 2- and 3-dimensional works. Stephen Jackson did not at first want to become an artist, but when his father, the great master Nathan Jackson, gave him choice to work at McDonald's or get $5 an hour to work with him, he started his artistic training. He ended up being trained by the traditional manner by apprenticing to his father. And I'm so sorry. I want to thank the 5 artists that I'm talking about today because each of them was willing to talk with me at great length. And so I thank them all for being willing to talk with me. And so the words that I'm using are quotes from their statements. Stephen was not content with this art. He says, quote, "Things develop slowly in Northwest Coast art. It's a conservative tradition. You need to learn forms, but not to be original is boring. I'm bored with the status quo and want to do something risky." At one point, Stephen began designing an asymmetrical commission. When the commissioner saw it, he told Stephen that, quote, "This powerful design should be in a museum, not in my house," unquote. So Stephen responded with a conventional work. But he continued questioning more and more seriously what he was doing and why he was doing it. He asked questions like, why make clan images? The unsatisfactory answer was that he was being paid to make some, and people wanted them. He became increasingly inventive and experimental. Like Chopard, whom he acknowledges, he began to put different things in different places, simplify forms, break up the holes, change things. Well, Stephen wanted to do something risky, and he got his opportunity to do something risky with a commission that the Burke had to carve a pole. His father also carved one, and both were replacements for two posts that had been repatriated to Cape Fox. That's right, Robin, isn't it? Stephen described how he spent hours ridding himself of old habits, trying to see things with new eyes. Then he drew for half an hour, and he came up with this idea. How to actually make it posed a problem. He tried carving, but wood wouldn't work to make that. Should it be mixed medium? Should it be aluminum? Or should it be, as it was, epoxy resin? He has pierced the space, stretched forms that seem to wrestle with one another, created an image in which nothing is a complete whole. Can I have the next one? This is the artwork as it was being made, and then the next one. And here is the completed project. He has added great drama to a tradition often associated with quiet elegance. The subject of his pole is death. He asked, what would death be like? He wanted to depict a visceral impact, violent death, with allusions to decapitation, dismemberment in what he calls a multiple exposure. Stephen indicates that while most Tlingit poles are static and not narrative, at least the strongman pole depicts a dramatic moment in the story. He also wanted the pole to convey the larger historical context of the appropriation and repatriation of the original pole. Quote, I wanted to communicate that these pieces have been taken away and given back. I wanted to reflect that situation, wanted to give the cultural disruption back to the museum. I guess this is an exaggerated representation of taking and giving back. Although some find this pole profoundly disturbing in its confident challenge to artistic conventions, Stephen Jackson's work is certainly a logical progression of formal experimentation combined with meaning, begun by Jim Chopard. The other artists I discussed this morning, Larry McNeil, Tanis S'eiltin, Dakaheen Maynor, and Nick Galanin create works even more remote from formline conventions than Stephen's. This might be in part due to the fact that they all traveled from home to pursue Masters of Fine Arts degrees in university settings, where they were introduced to native and non-native artists who influenced their development while encouraging innovation and creativity. The strength of Tlingit artistic traditions can hamper creativity, for when, as Stephen described, for when something diverges from tradition, some viewers become uncomfortable and simply can't relate. Photographer Larry McNeil, whose work is here, responds by pointing to Raven, and here's one of his photographs, collages of Raven, arguing that, quote, our Tlingit culture embraces the idea of tradition and change, which is ironic by definition. Raven the trickster is a changeling, yet he is at the core of one of our key mythological stories. The concept of tradition and change are constantly in odds with each other, which is at the core of what my art is all about. My art is about what happens at the intersection of Western and Tlingit cultures, which can be very ironic, humorous, and tragic at once. Nick Galanin describes how he has, over the years, gotten pulled in many different directions. And this is one of his masks made from a book, in this case, of music. Different teachers wanted me to do different things, like my uncle Will. We clashed sometimes, unquote. His inspirations came from both native and non-native artists, and he sometimes expresses frustration by conservative trends and technology. But at the same time, he expresses great concern that sometimes elders cannot see their culture in his works. As he said, and he said this the other day too, when you jump too far, the culture doesn't always follow. I try to find visual clues that the elders can understand, like Tlingit mask. This is a paper mask made from a Tlingit mask prototype. When one looks at Tanis's small-scale assemblages, little appears to connect to her Tlingit background. And this is a work that opens. You can see this is closed and that is open. But as she described the other day, she worked with her mother as a child in materials such as fur, and here creates works that refer to aspects of her heritage. Some object to these pieces because they're not refined, as is so much historic Tlingit art. And she has been accused of saying that this makes them, quote, inauthentic. And created as they are with found materials, and obviously they are not masks or headdresses or baskets, they couldn't possibly be traditional. As Tanis states, some people's concept of traditional art is limiting, as they expect native art to remain the same, to stay constant, otherwise it cannot be considered art. It is also in the tradition of modernist artists. Tanis challenges both the native and non-native artistic traditions with these pieces, for she intentionally breaks rules that she was taught by her mother and in printmaking school. Creating Savage Apparel, which is one of these pieces, was an intuitive and playful response to regimented creative activities that were encouraged by my mother and academia. So clearly, critics that prefer Northwest Coast art to look like Northwest Coast art would have difficulty with the works of these artists. To go beyond their dissonances with visual traditions, I would like to discuss, in part, what these artists are attempting to communicate. Deka Heen, who actually goes by the first name Deka, for example, is of mixed German Tlingit heritage, and he uses photographs to analyze his place in the world. Several years ago, he was looking at a Southeast photographic archive when he saw a photograph of a man with his name. Through the feats of modern technology, he includes himself in a mirror image, he's at the left, holding a camera. Quote, "I'm reflecting on the past, trying to find what is truth in the images and what is artificially constructed history. I think these images bring up more questions than they answer," which, of course, when you try to be analytic, that's always what happens. Next. Deka has a very unusual beard. It is one half dark and one half light, and he features this beard in his self-portrait, and the title is 7/16, and he is, quote-unquote, 7/16 native. It's a photograph of the lower part of his face, superimposed by his native identity card. And this image, incidentally, won the Alaska Positive 2006 exhibition's Juror's Choice Award, which we're very, very pleased with. He got his MFA at UAF in the Native Arts program, so we're all very proud of him. Early in graduate school, Deka started making traditional copper daggers. As his art matured, these daggers evolved into artistic statements of culture and identity. This is about yay big. In his MFA exhibit in the Native Arts program at UAF, Deka exhibited a number of daggers, such as this double-headed one. Can I have the next slide? And you can see this is a double-headed one. And he says about these daggers are like those that Tlingit used in war. We were a culture of warriors, and we're still fighting now to survive. Daggers to me mean other conflicts, the war this country is in right now, the personal battles within families. In addition to those allusions to struggles, this large double-headed dagger refers to my own multicultural heritage. Nick focuses his analysis on identity formation in books and in museum exhibits that address Tlingit culture, which he feels show it as dead. Quote, "People write about culture and then go into the wormholes of history. They really don't look at what's happening now." This self-portrait is made from the pages of Frederica de Laguna's Under Mount St. Elias. So that's actually a book that he's cut up into his face. Here is a real person composed of a representation of that person's culture by an outsider. In the original installation of this work for his MFA thesis, which he did in New Zealand, near the mask was a video of an immense number of artworks. Nick showed this the other day if you were there. A video of artworks shown in very quick succession, many to the second. As they flash by, the non-native visitor cannot possibly grasp the meaning of any individual work. The book, in contrast, is a representation that the outsider can have as permanent, readable, and understandable. The significant cultural objects that actually do embody the history and the culture of the group, the works that were being flashed on the screen, are alien to the non-native who can't see them anyway. The idea of how a culture is portrayed and packaged for educational purposes to be viewed one bit at a time is what Nick says. Excuse me. And this is another one of his works. This is based on a mask, but it is composed of the Bible. That is a Bible that the words are. Nick becomes even more critical of outside representations in another video, and I'm sorry I don't have these. He had them, but I don't have them. This one called Talking Totem Poles. The narrator stands reading from a 1970 book on totem poles in the most dull fashion possible. And as he says, the narrative is a dry reading about poles from an anthropological text. It kills every aspect of the living quality of the pole. It rips it out of place. Totem poles are talked about, but not understood. Books dictate what cultures should be like today. That affects all kinds of people: artists, elders, gallery owners, museums. Also in the exhibit is a photograph of Nick himself in 3 separate modes, carrying different items related to different historical periods. In traditional robes, he's carrying a dagger. As a late 19th century person, he's carrying a Bible. And here on the left, he's carrying a briefcase. But notice he is shoeless in every single one of those. As is clear from the discussion of Deka and Nick's works, photography is a natural medium for sharing views on identity. For photographer Larry McNeil, quote, "Art is the physical manifestation of what's happening with my identity. It's a reflection of my interpretation of things that are happening in this world. A lot has to do with attitude, laughing in the face of adversity. Humor and tragedy are so intertwined. The elders in the past would use humor at critical moments." So in some of his works, he includes portraits of his ancestors of the Killer Whale Clan house in Klukwan and other important individuals from history. These images are juxtaposed with other references to Tlingit culture. And he says, again, "These people had so many difficulties to overcome in order to be successful, but they did end up well. I acknowledge their strength through these images." This dreamlike image of a photograph, this dreamlike photograph, shows a 19th century formal photograph of ancestors before a large, beautifully colored abstract image that one realizes is a killer whale fin. McNeil also does self-portraits. The self-portrait is a wonderful way of, obviously, to communicate identity. And this is a work entitled In the True Spirit of the White Man. And that's Larry in front of his card. Larry started off as a writer. And so he usually has a text. Often he's got a text in his photographs. And very often he is started off with a text. And then he makes the image. So, and this is what that, I'm quoting much of what that text says. "In the true spirit of the white man, I stole this car in my search for America. Just call it manifested destiny. I asked the owner to take my picture in front of his car before I took it, and assured him that it was the gods that will take care of the car. God meant for this fine machine to be flying down the freeway," I told him. "Are you a real Indian?" he asked. "I thought you were all vanished." "As soon as you give me the keys, I'll be another vanished Indian," I told him. "Could you look more noble?" I told him, "Sorry, this is as stoic as I can manage for right now." He asked if I had any regalia to put on to make it look more authentic. He said his grandfather was Edward Curtis. "Thanks for the car," I told him, "but I've got some serious vanishing to catch up on." This photograph expresses many things. Curtis as the greatest promoter of the vanishing Indian myth, the history of appropriation and colonization, the resistance of today's Native people to stereotyping, their aggressive assertion of strength and autonomy, the stars and stripes so beloved by patriots transformed into a gasoline-guzzling commodity, which of course brings us back to the war, the reason for the wars we're currently enduring. And when I was looking at this the other day, I just said, oh my God, is that a skull? Is that a skull emerging from the painted background? If so, it lends a highly sober note to this otherwise very funny representation. McNeil also refers in his works to myth, particularly of Raven, and one could go. Larry has a website which all these photographs are on, and I urge you to go. It is larrymcneil.com. His works are very, very funny and very serious. So this is a photograph from his works, and then there was a billboard that was made. There was a billboard project in the Southwest, and that photograph ended up being on a huge billboard. McNeil refers in his works to myth. A lot of his works deal with myth, particularly that of Raven. And this is one way he expands his art beyond strictly Tlingit reference, as he asserts that every culture has its myths, which as a result are one of the connecting elements of the foundation of humanity. Why do people make myths, he asks? Well, he says, I like the explanation that myths satisfy a yearning to compensate for their history, which is deficient in some manner. Humans have a yearning for history that is more heroic than the ones they actually have, unquote. Thank you. And Tanis, I hope I'm not going to get this wrong. I apologize ahead of time if I do. For Tanis, identity is intimately interconnected with contemporary political issues. In her impressive installation, Resisting Acts of Distillation, she challenges ANGSA, land allocation, corporate establishment, land stewardship, and the blood quantum level that determines in Native identity in 1,000 square feet. Reflecting on the history of Native Americans, Tanis asks, does ANGSA represent termination in disguise? Is it part of the assimilationist cycle? She argues that ANGSA can be understood as a dismemberment of the tribal organization, analogous to the Dawes Act of the 1880s, which intended to destroy the power of tribal organization. With expressive artistic energy, she despairs how tribal identity is now linked with corporate shares and commercial profits from selling natural resources. Former standards of tribal identity now translate into standards of corporate wealth or poverty. And in this, we have tubes of red wine corked with beeswax that hang like curtains from the ceiling. Along the wall are vases of water that hold petroleum oil. The oil refers to the reason for ANGSA in the first place, oil and hands to oil. This installation is critical of the present social, political, economic situation of Alaska Natives. The imposition of blood quantum percentages to determine membership in the group, the inequity inherent in the system. There is the risk that Tanis's work could be so despairing that they would drain viewer and artist alike. But as she states, when I deal with the difficult issues of discrimination, it's hard to pull back from the research and depiction in this art and end on a positive note. I like to represent positive aspects in my art as well, like the strength of present-day Native people, our ability to maintain language, dance, and art. At the far end, this neon tina reflects endurance. And you will see images of this wonderful helmet, which is a work of art at the American Museum of Natural History. She says, this signifies our ability to resist entities that threaten self-awareness and cultural identity. If ANGSA represents the social and legal dilution of a tribe, it does not represent the loss of power to fight for our rights. Next one, please. I would like to stress that Tanis's installations are much more than political statements. They are artistic experiences. And that differentiates the strident voice of rebellion and challenge from the convincing persuasion of poetic expression. One encounters in this installation different shades of glowing red as one explores the room, the place of which is accentuated by the hanging vials. You see the art on the walls through those curtains, which are transparent but still very present, interacting with the shelves on the wall, the masks, the glowing tina. There are many ideas conveyed here, but just as many are nonverbal sensory expressions that touch one's soul as well as one's mind. There is much, much more to say about these 5 artists that I've discussed today. Indeed, books could be written about the kinds of innovations their art represents. They are certainly original, sometimes dazzlingly so. And some might say that they diverge so far from Tlingit visual traditions that they shouldn't be identified at all as Tlingit artists. But what is Tlingit art? It is, of course, the elegant form-line style so appreciated by all. But form is not all, for in Tlingit culture, art has great meaning and it is the ultimate expression of identity. It conveys one's lineage and history. And here's a photograph of a chief at last year's, or the previous celebration. As Clarissa Hudson declared yesterday, we wear our history. Today, people don't live only in their own village, even if they reside there all the time. They, like everybody else, are affected by the larger world with its politics, economic influences, wars, governmental policies, discrimination, stereotyping. I could go on and on. For some living in today's world, identity emerges within the commercialized, globalized world in which Native people are a minority. Often using humor, but sometimes deadly serious, these Tlingit artists make important and timely statements about the world and the representation and treatment of Native people. They address the identity of the contemporary Tlingit individual, supplementing, enhancing, and bringing up to date their identities as members in lineages and houses. No. They address many contemporary issues, and I just want to quickly end up with some recent works. This is a work by Deka, and it is a vial of oil in the form of a dagger. It alludes specifically for the reason for the war right now. And Tanis has done a brilliant installation recently on relating the connection between the war and Goon. Thank you. And this is a part of it. Next. And then we also have Larry, who is always humorous, and now he's dealing not only with myths of his own Tlingit heritage, but he's dealing with myths of Tonto and lots of other Hollywood versions of Indians, and I just urge you to read those. They're very, very funny. Just as last one. This one is really remarkable. And this is Stephen Jackson playing with Photoshop, but discovering that when he plays with Photoshop, ovoids emerge. Just as Stephen Jackson represents a logical development of the form-line style, Tanis, Larry, Deka, and Nick represent a logical development of the meaning of Tlingit art as expression of identity. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Marie Victor-Howe, who I've had the pleasure of meeting at this conference. The subject of her presentation is Tlingit Carved Horn Spoons. The title of her presentation, Feeding the Ancestors, Tlingit Carved Horn Spoons, is also the title of the upcoming book, which this flyer, if you may have seen it floating around during the time at this conference, states it's coming out in June 2007, but Anne-Marie informed me that it's actually coming out in May. So we're looking forward to seeing that publication, and right now we'll get to hear a preview of her work. Here's Anne-Marie.
So I'm missing the first slides, but actually it's a cover of the book, and I have some photocopy in the back over there. So I would like first to thank our host clan, the Kiks.adi.
You have to talk into the microphone.
I would like to thank our host clan, the Kiks.adi, to allow us to come here on their land. I'm very grateful to all the Tlingit people, historian and elder, always as well as scholar, for sharing their knowledge. I cannot name each individual today, but I just want to say that Feeding the Ancestor would not have been written without your collaboration. I finally want to thank the coordinator of this conference. I'm going to talk about a collection of Tlingit fish spoons that are now at the Peabody Museum, Harvard University. This project started when in 2001 I was offered a fellowship by our director, Ruby Watson. She asked me to write a book about one of the Northwest Coast collection of my choice. I used to spend much time in storage room, and one area I particularly liked was located on the 6th floor. It was a rather small place with soft light and low ceiling with many rows of shelves filled with spectacular and varied ethnographic objects from all over the world. In one area, the wooden carved figure of different sizes and shapes stood there like a wild forest that over time started to grow and breathe deep in my heart. They come from the northwest coast of North America. The majority were of Tlingit manufacture, wooden mask with round open eyes and opercular teeth, wooden helmet, wooden rattles shaped like birds, crest hat and frontlets crowned with sea lion whisker or fringed with ermine, and many elegant wooden bent or carved bowl with undulating rim, their design depicting creatures, human figure or animal form. Years later, while working as an anthropologist at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and in Juneau, I was able to join and help Tlingit and Haida family harvesting herring eggs on kelp, abalone, cockles, gumbots, sea cucumber, sea urchin, and other intertidal food in southeastern Alaska. I helped to pack some prize food, sometimes called prestige food, to be sent to relatives, friends, neighbors, visitors, and others who could not get their own supplies, such as elders or people without boats, and also institutions such as the Pioneers' Home in Sitka. The daily life of the Tlingit people has traditionally revolved around the food cycle, gathering, preparing, and preserving food dictated where people would be and what they would be doing for about 9 months of the year. Summer fishing camps were an opening to travel and enjoy new experiences. I remember several Tlingit and Haida women telling me about that particular time of the year and how exciting it was for the children to be away from the more structured life of the village. Nowadays, time available for harvest is much more limited because people are working for wages and sometimes they have to move to bigger towns far away from their traditional harvesting ground. Harvesting and consuming traditional food is a way of life. It is part of Tlingit culture, a lifelong habit, quote, a love affair, unquote, as Justin Brown said while being interviewed by Nora Marks Danauer. The Danauer described as George Dalton was carving a halibut hook with figures like Strengthman and the raven backbone. He sent, quote, words of encouragement as he made the set, asking them to go down and fight with the big honor, the halibut, unquote. Food is spirit, and therefore it is not considered lightly. The Danauers also describe how before Emma Mark's father died, her mother prepared him, quote, his favorite smoked hooligan preserved in oil. But he died before he could eat any from the 5-gallon cans of hooligans she has put away. They reserve the hooligan and serve them during his memorial. The favorite food of the deceased was always part of the many courses cooked for his memorial, and it was brought out in large elegant wooden boxes and bowls decorated with the clan crest. One remarkable example of such a large Tlingit feast bowl is a wooden worm piece from the well house in Klukwan. Both ends of the bowl were carved into humanoid woodworm heads. From these large dishes, the food was ladled onto smaller bowls, often carved into an animal form, with enough food for 4 to 6 people. In turn, each individual of higher rank was given decorated horn spoons to ladle their food into smaller wooden or sometimes sheep horn bowls. Large bowl and platter with fewer decoration were used by several persons of the lower rank, all eating out of the same bowl. Children used small bowl with fixed sides. The sides and the lavishness of the container, covered with the family crest, corresponded to the rank of the particular guest who used them. As each higher-ranking guest was given a dish, quote, the speaker called out the name of the dish or bowl and the corresponding ancestral history. All were urged to eat well and to eat as much as possible. Whatever food remained was taken home by the guest as a gift from the host, often in finely rough little wooden dish. As we can see in this part of the ceremony, there is a close relationship between hierarchy and ornamentation. Decorate bowls and spoon were valued as symbol of rank and wealth, and also mediated between the natural biological act of eating and the human cultural act of feasting. About 40 spoons in the Peabody Museum collections were made from the horn of the mountain goats and doll sheep, their handles elaborately carved with human and animal figures. This spoon, still perspiring seal and hooligan oil soaked into them through long use, play a vital role in ceremonies and social functions, and serve as elaborate records of important events. The spoon handle were like Paul. They feature the oral history and legend of the clan. David Katzik once told me, quote, our family history is carved on this spoon. They show how important it is for the Tlingit people to know who they are and how intricately woven the culture of the Tlingit is, unquote. These spoons were also referred to by Bill Holm as, quote, the family silver of the nobility, unquote. And for this reason, these spoons and bowl were owned by the clan and passed from one generation to the next. The majority of the spoons in this collection were sold in 1869 by Edward Fast, a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, to the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, with about 7 other Tsimshian, Haida, and Tlingit objects. However, the majority of the Peabody Museum collection is of Tlingit manufacture. I have to agree with several Tlingit scholars and Stephen Herikson, curator of the Alaska State Museum, that Fast, who was stationed in Sitka over a period of 10 months, from October 1867 to July 1868, did not collect all these objects. Besides its size, the collection is composed of some pieces that were manufactured much earlier. This is true for both the spoon collection and the collection of fish bowl. The group of objects is also quite diverse, including masks, dresses, shamanic dolls, rattles, armors, daggers, fishbowl, horn spoon, ladle, so on. It is a very unique and rare collection of. We have also a very unique and rare collection of decorated throwing sticks. Almost certainly, much of the vast collection consists partly of the contents of the Russian Museum in Sitka, objects that were collected during the Russian-American era and left behind when the United States purchased Alaska only months before Fast arrived. Fast definitively did collect some of the object himself. One of the best sources for this is a man named Emil Teichmann, who was in Sitka at the same time as representative of a leading London fur company. According to Teichmann, Fast used several methods to secure the object. One was simply to buy the artifacts from local native intermediaries, among them an old shaman who lived in Sitka. During one such transaction, Fast supplied the shaman with plenty of whiskey and tobacco. And in the end, he was able to get the piece he wanted for only 25 cents. A second collecting method used by Fast was to visit the Tlingit village to buy objects there. That was not as easy as it sounds, as the village was separated from the town by a wooden 18 feet high palisade. You can actually see the palisade here. Finally, Fast raided graveyards. We know that sad, disturbing fact only because Teichmann recounts one such raid by Fast of a graveyard on a small island near Sitka. As for the material, the spoons are made of mountain goat and doll sheep horn. The smaller spoons in the collection were mostly carved from a single horn of a mountain goat. Only a few were made from doll sheep horn. Larger spoons were made into pieces. The handle, most often, of the dark mountain goat horn, and the bowls of the translucent amber horn of doll sheep. As I mentioned earlier, before contact with Europeans, I didn't mention it, that the two pieces were fastened together with rivets of mountain goat horn or copper. But by the 1900s, people commonly use metal rivets. Bowls and handles were also shaped in a two-piece wooden mold. Sometimes an entire horn was used to make the handle, and in that case, the carver kept the original shape of the horn. The decorative carving was done after the handle was plunged into warm water to soften the material. Finally, the spoon was polished by using the rough skin of a dogfish. I would have liked to talk about how Tlingit hunt mountain goat during the fall season and their favorite hunting ground. I would have liked also to talk about the processing of different parts of the mountain goat and how the white tallow was, quote, an important ingredient of fish dishes, unquote. However, I don't have enough time for this. I will just say one thing about the Tlingit belief about these animals that live in inaccessible places, high in the rugged mountains, close to the sky, close to the distant realms. Needless to say, because of all these associations, Tlingit shamans, who were medium for spirit, often wear dresses crowned by mountain goat horns. The horns were powerful to shamans because, first, they protect them during their dangerous journey to distant realms, and second, they help them negotiate the difficult terrain they navigated through space. Mountain goats have pads on the bottom of their feet that help them keep their balance in the most unbelievable places, inaccessible to any humans. First, one can easily understand why Tlingit Carver chose this unique material to memorize the clan story. Their choice was not just a question of texture, beauty, and aesthetic. It was rather the sensitivity to the absolutely essential. The horn of the mountain goat was indeed the best place for the clan story to be featured, unifying the Tlingit people as a whole with their land and with the places where the ancestors live. I am now going to tell you one story of one particular spoon. It is a spoon 69-30-10-1740. It's a story of the Thunderbird, and it was told by Frank Italio in 1949 to De Laguna, and it explained why the Gwaii belonged to the Thunderbird clan. Quote, briefly summarize, it's not what you quote. The story tells how some people traveling by canoe went ashore at a place called Glacier Point to have lunch. When they continued their journey, they left behind a napping 4-year-old boy. By the time they noticed him missing, it was too late. To reach Glacier Bay again, they would have had to paddle against the current for 4 days, and by then, the little boy would have died of starvation. They had a big potlatch for the boy, and the Gwaii made a morning song to record the sad event. When the boy woke up all alone, he started crying, and a passing Thunderbird, who looked like human, heard his cries and took him into a cave where he raised him. When the boy grew into a young man, he began to miss his family, and the Thunderbird thought it would be best for him to return home. Before he left, the boy grew Thunderbird quills on his lower arm and legs. Back home, he told everyone of his ordeal and instructed his people to build a Thunderbird house. He also painted the Thunderbird screen inside the house and composed a song. The crest represented on the lower part of the handle often seems to be leaping into the spoon bowl. In one particular example, the lowermost figure is a frog, while the rest of the handle represents a sculpin. Both animals look like they are alive. The frog literally springing from the sculpin mouth to feed itself with the seal or hooligan inside the bowl. Therefore, both the frog figure, inhabited by the spirit of the crest, the spirit of the ancestor, and the higher-ranking guest who brings the spoon to fill with oil to his mouth, are feeding at the same time with the oil, a delicacy symbolizing abundance, richness, and vital energy. Fish spoons are very aesthetic indeed, but most of all, they are objects of power. Sergei Kan stressed that the memorial was, quote, an opportunity for the host to memorialize, honor, and please all the departed matriarchs, unquote. At the same time, the guests, quote, represent and incarnated their own matrilineal ancestors, whose names were carried and whose regalia they wore, unquote. Their role as mediator between the living and the dead was enhanced by their use of objects that once has been used by the deceased and his or her ancestors. The feeding of the dead was a crucial part of the memorial. Food and water were offered to all of the dead members of one matrilineal groups who were believed to be present in the house during the ceremony. The food was also displayed in what is called the fire dish. One way to symbolically also feed the disease was to place the food in a fire. That way it was transferred through the fire to a specific individual who has been named in the ceremony. Another way was for the host to feed their guests by hand by placing a little bit of food directly into their guest's mouth. When this was done, the guests ate the solid food using their hand and drank the oil from the spoon. By eating food given to them by the host and using the host utensils decorated with the host crest, the guest not only nourish the disease, but also reassure him that he still had standing in the society and remain a valued member of his clan. Thank you.
Our next speaker is out of order from what is listed here. It's Ashley Verplank. She's currently a graduate student at the University of Washington, and the subject of her presentation is Tlingit, the evolution of Tlingit daggers. She has to make her way to the airport shortly, so that's the reason for the change in the schedule. Here's Ashley Verplank.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. I just wanted to say a special thank you to Andy Hope, Sergei Kan, and especially to Steve Henriksen for putting this all together, and also to Steve for answering all of my questions about daggers. And also, I just wanted to mention that this paper, I couldn't provide all the details that I've learned about daggers. And so this exploration here is just up until the beginning of the 19th century. And I mean no disrespect to Tlingit artists that have continued on the dagger tradition. I just didn't have time to include them in this paper. So once again, this presentation will provide a historical and visual overview of the changing form and function of the Tlingit dagger. I will discuss how the materials used to create daggers were tied to historical events on the coast, and are a testimony not only to contact and trade, but to the ingenuity and skill of Tlingit artists and metalsmithers. It is my hope that an in-depth study of the dagger's role, both within and outside of the Native community, will prove that not only did its form, but its material directly relate to its function. Through stylistic analysis of blades, pommels, hilts, and guards, I am creating a tentative timeline for dagger materials and styles. Throughout Southeast Alaska, the Tlingit have proven their ability to recognize and utilize the benefits of both native and non-native metals. As a whole, their ingenuity and adaptation of materials and styles enabled the dagger to continually evolve in the areas of technique, style, and duty. It has functioned as an implement of protection during warfare, a ceremonial status symbol, a declaration of family heritage, and a moneymaker for the tourist trade. Sorry, get a little behind that. Even today, the dagger is enjoying, sorry about that. Even today, the dagger is enjoying a new chapter in its long life. Repatriation of daggers from museums to their original tribal families acknowledges the importance of these objects within the Tlingit community itself. Previously, no advanced scholarship on daggers outside of the Native community existed, and a detailed survey of these objects is not only solidifying their purposefully artful existence, but also demonstrating and reaffirming to contemporary natives and outsiders the power, skill, and ingenuity of Tlingit artists. People ask me why I chose to study daggers. I don't have time here to convey the details, but part of it is the mystery of the unknown and the great beauty of such a powerful and deadly object. the pure artistry of a weapon surrounded with taboos and strict guidelines which are still appreciated and acknowledged today. This exploration of daggers has opened my eyes to the unfailing ability of Native artists to adapt and innovate. It is my hope that further scholarship in this realm will facilitate a new appreciation and understanding of the Tlingit dagger outside of the Native community. For those of you unfamiliar with the specific vocabulary of knives and daggers, I will provide you with a few quick explanations. One question I hear a lot is, what's the difference between a dagger and a knife? The simple answer is that daggers have two sharpened edges, while a knife generally only has one. Daggers are for stabbing or thrusting, while knives are for cutting. Now, of course, daggers were used to cut as well, but their most effective function in warfare was to create a stab wound that would not easily heal. Aspects of the dagger that were fundamental to my investigation are the blade, guard, hilt, and pommel. The blade can come in a variety of shapes and materials, but today I will only be dealing with copper, iron, and steel. The guards, however, can come in copper, leather, horn, ivory, wood, or iron, and their main function is to provide a protective barrier for the hand between the top of the blade and the bottom of the hilt. On double-bladed examples, there will be an upper and lower guard. The hilt is where the user places their hand just above the blade. The pommel is the extension above the hilt and comes in a wide variety of forms and materials. Another important aspect is the thong, a long piece of leather or hide that extends from the upper back of the hilt. In most examples, it is attached with a tail that is secured underneath the hilt wrapping. Thongs are typically only present on daggers which were utilized in warfare and have a slit at the end for the warrior to insert their metal finger, wrapping the remaining length of leather around their wrist. This ensures that the dagger will not be knocked from the owner's hand during battle. Some daggers also have a hand strap. This is a wide strip of leather that is attached at the top and bottom of the hilt, providing an area for the user to slip their hand underneath. A small group of daggers have their original thong and hand strap. This demonstrates that these two items functioned well together and were a popular and possibly necessary item during warfare. The 1780s and 90s marked the fur trade boom on the Northwest coast. Bolstered by tales from Captain Cook's 1778 voyage, merchant navigators flocked to the coast. This was a period of great change for the Tlingit and one that shaped them in ways they never imagined. Trade goods flooded the coast and the dagger's life changed forever. The physical style of the Tlingit dagger has changed many times over its existence. Early examples from the late 18th century appear to be all one piece and have simple pommel designs. Despite this simplicity, the metalwork is still advanced. A drawing from 1786 depicts a Tlingit man wearing a sheathed dagger. The metal pommel here is fashioned into a single spiral. This is typically known as the Athabascan style. It is recognizable by its single or bifurcated pommel, the ends of which are curled into tight spirals. The blade usually has a raised, tapering median line in front and is completely flat on the back. The hilt is very slender and wrapped with leather. It is believed that the Tlingit learned their metalsmithing techniques from their northern neighbors, the Athabascans, who provided them with their supply of copper before contact. It makes sense then that some early Tlingit daggers may have been acquired through trade with the North, or may just be similar to the northern style. George Dixon recalls seeing Tlingit daggers made of copper in 1787. This is not surprising since copper was the most readily available and naturally occurring element or metal on the coast. Yet a full decade earlier, Captain Cook found that iron was the trade metal preferred by natives and that they were quite familiar with how to work it. native metalsmiths had learned the strength and durability of iron, and once trade commenced, it quickly replaced copper for tools and weapons. There has been a debate surrounding the question of where natives obtained iron before contact. The most plausible explanation is from shipwrecks along the coast. Tlingit oral histories tell the story of its discovery on the shore and that it was attached to pieces of wood. This supports and validates the shipwreck theory, along with the fact that the Black Stream current from Japan frequently washed disabled junks, which are boats, onto North America's coastline. In any case, it is apparent that the Tlingit people had the knowledge and skill to produce sophisticated daggers before contact with non-natives. Dixon acquired 2 copper daggers from the Tlingit. One has a bifurcated pommel without the spiral endings and exhibits a raised center median line on the blade. The median line is a telltale trait of Northwest Coast metalsmithing. Practically every blade of native manufacture had some type of median shift on the front of the blade. The most popular style was a single raised median line that narrowed towards the tips. The other major style had 2 raised lines which flanked a concave channel that ran down the blade and tapered at the tip. The second Tlingit dagger Dixon collected was double-bladed. George Emmons called this style the earliest form of fighting knife. In the 18th century, the dagger's main function was as a weapon. Men wore them sheathed hanging across their chest and prized them as status-imbued implements of warfare. It is said by Frederica de Laguna that the Tlingit word for dagger meant something close to one's hand, or as George Ramos stated it, something handy. This denotes the importance of this object within the Native community, both before and during the early years of Euro-American contact. Many times, the blade and pommel style of these weapons maximize the efficiency of their role in warfare. The double-bladed dagger utilized the pommel as a second blade. This form served a function and was preeminent in warfare, allowing the dagger to be a formidable weapon with an added opportunity for inflicting wounds with both ends. Numerous examples of double-bladed daggers exist today. The majority have an elegantly wide raised line down the central median. It is often well crafted, and the median line carries on from tip to tip, tapering at either end. Typically, a one-piece hilt connected the upper and lower blades. The back of each blade was gracefully concave, sloping to the once sharpened edges. The elegance of this style is astonishing, and the ingenuity incorporated is even more impressive. Tlingit metalsmiths were able to master a technique used to thicken the medial portion of the blade. Copper was a relatively soft metal, so smiths had to find a way to strengthen the blade without adding too much weight to the dagger. By creating a thick central median line, makers were able to add strength and mobility to their blades. Tlingit smiths brought this technique to iron when it was acquired, and also knew how to increase the density of the metal along the edges and center through heating and cooling techniques. Early double-bladed daggers did not have permanent guards or decorative flourishes. The upper and lower guards were created by wrapping a thick piece of animal hide around the hilt and lashing it in place with thin strips of leather. The hide used was longer than the hilt on either side, and so it covered the shoulders of the lower and upper blade and protected the warrior's hand. In 1789, Alejandro Malaspina collected 2 iron daggers. One of these is bifurcated, while the other appears to represent the face of a being or animal. This provides further evidence that there were already multiple styles of daggers in existence on the coast at that time. This pommel imagery gives testimony to Tlingit artists whose creative ability allowed them to innovate and explore beyond the previously known styles and techniques. The dagger was an object of power, pride, and status, which could be enhanced with ingenuity and the use of newly acquired steel tools. As time passed, both iron and copper became abundant materials on the coast. Due to this and the availability of steel tools, native metalsmiths began to get more creative and daring with their forms. They learned new fabrication methods and were quick to embrace new technology. Soon copper began to appear again, not only as a blade, but as a decorative flourish. The abundance of sheet copper brought by the fur traders enhanced the appearance of native-made daggers. Copper and eventually iron was shaped and sometimes engraved, a technique that Bill Holm believes was a product of the early contact period. The blades of many daggers were elegantly fluted so as to create a jagged and deadly wound that would not easily heal. The symmetry and sleekness of these flutes are a testimony to the patience and skill of its creator. During this time period, metalsmiths were continually evolving and producing a more effective weapon. Over time, pommels began to take on more recognizable forms. Images relating to the owner's life began to populate the weapon. These images could relate to crests, oral histories, and ancestral histories, and more. Ancestral heritage, pardon me. Daggers were given great names and inlaid with precious shells and stored in bentwood cases when they were not in use. Treasured by their owner, a dagger was not only a weapon, but an object of great pride. A well-crafted dagger pronounced the importance and prestige of the person wearing it and invoked jealousy and respect. Dogfish, bear, raven, eagle, killer whale, wolf, and hawk all made appearances along with a multitude of other beings. Status was an integral part of Northwest Coast society, and so one can infer that the more elaborate and sophisticated the dagger, the higher the status of its owner. And here you can see the Tlingit man wearing his dagger. And I think the pommel is actually covered with a sheath. They often had separate mini sheaths for the pommel. In the late 18th century, the fur traders also brought large amounts of firearms and ammunition to the coast. The introduction of the musket was the beginning of the end for the dagger's life in warfare. It was no longer considered the most effective tool during battle, but it still held an important role in the lives of men for many years afterwards. Throughout the 19th century, pommel styles continued to evolve and change, along with the resources available on the coast. Numerous daggers were hammered from old files and are visually recognizable because of the faint and sometimes prominent hatch marks that remain. And I put this one up again so you can just see the ridges along the bottom edge. This was made from a file. So that's one of the ways you can tell that it came from a file. As European and American boats flooded the coast, so did prefabricated blades. Sword, bayonet, and knife blades were welcome trade materials on the coast. Blades acquired through contact can be differentiated from native-made blades. They are usually flat on both sides and are not completely sharpened on both edges. Tlingit artists were eager to embrace these goods, and suddenly the effort and time that went into making a dagger was greatly reduced. Now more effort was placed on designing the pommel, which would be hafted onto the trade blade. Hafting is the term used to describe the attachment of a pommel to the blade. It refers to daggers that are not created in one piece, but have a separate blade and pommel. It involves the tang of the blade, as you can see here, which is covered by the material such as wood, which makes up the hilt. The hilt material is often part of the pommel. A wooden pommel will either have a bifurcated leg and the tang is slipped between these two legs and wrapped with hide, or the pommel can have one leg that extends down and a separate slat of wood placed on the backside. This is then wrapped with hide. These hilt legs usually also create the guard. This change allowed artists to expand their creativity and carve materials such as wood, bone, ivory, and horn. Working the metal was no longer the most important aspect of dagger adornment. It was now the fabrication of the non-metal pommel. And here you can see I've put up, this is a hilt, and the one on the bottom is thicker, and that's actually the leg that's part of the pommel. And then the thinner one is the slat that's placed behind it. Not only is the Tlingit artists' creativity astounding in the sheer diversity of their imagery, but also in their material versatility. This new style of dagger fabrication opened doors for dagger artists that had never existed before. They embraced the benefits of trade, carving elaborate pommels out of materials like musket stocks and inlaying them with status-enhancing items such as copper, abalone, and operculum. As time passed and incidents of warfare disappeared, daggers began to lose their functional role in battle. Traditionally, they had held a ceremonial role in peace ceremonies, and so in the 19th century, their ceremonial role was expanded. Their function as a status symbol remained strong, and the owners proudly displayed their daggers at potlatches and other prestigious events. By the late 19th century, both colonists and tourists populated the northwest coast. This created a completely new avenue for daggers. Native artisans took the initiative and began to produce daggers for sale to collectors and tourists. The attitudes of the Victorian era created an entrepreneurial boom both for the creation and sale of Tlingit daggers, which directly affected the appearance and production of them well into the early 20th century. There is evidence that the native artists produced daggers that were designed to attract the attention of tourists, museums, and private collectors. The daggers were authentic and native-made, but not all of the dealers who sold to collectors acknowledged that they were contemporary versions. Because they were created by native metalsmiths, the decoration was authentic, yet some collectors believed that they were buying a much older piece. Most tourists, on the other hand, knew that they were buying a contemporary work and appreciated it for what it was. These beautiful and brilliant objects of art are easily recognizable today, and daggers created in this era stand out for their complete use of copper and elaborate decoration. The use of copper for the entire dagger is unique and important during this period. It demonstrates that the function of these daggers was not utilitarian. The strength of the blade was no longer paramount to its function, which by this time was to grace the curio cabinets of private collectors and educate the masses in museums around the world. Here, the central median line was created separately and riveted onto the blade. This proves that it was not meant for warfare. Since these were created for collectors and mainly sold in shops, it is unlikely that they were created for ceremonial purposes. The pommel and blade styles of these daggers are quite distinctive, and the large number in collections allow them to be dated with confidence. These copper daggers are once again a testimony to the ingenious entrepreneurial spirit of Tlingit artists who maintain the dagger tradition. Not only were the metal workers able to evolve and innovate, but also to create. They found a market for their talent and were able to share it with a wide variety of investors. In conclusion, this visual exploration of daggers has fostered a deep appreciation and respect for Tlingit men and women who produce these functional works of art. I just wanted to add in there too, there were female metalsmiths working on the coast as well. It has been an honor, well, at least one in this document. It has been an honor to spend time with these objects. Fundamental to this project are the actual daggers themselves and the Tlingit community. I hope that my work will be a collaboration between native and non-native resources. To date, I have been fortunate enough to study the Northwest Coast dagger collections at the Burke Museum in Seattle, the Peabody Museum at Harvard and Cambridge, the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, and the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Also, through a Smithsonian Institution fellowship, I was able to spend 10 weeks last summer researching daggers and related paper archives at the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. I would also like to say a special thanks to Eric Hollinger from the National Museum of Natural History for his help on this project, and also to Jack Nowitzki for introducing me to the double dagger headdress. So, thank you very much.
I think we're ready for our next presentation. Our exploration of the art forms on the northern northwest coast continues with Katie Bunmore-Hughes. From the time that I first met Katie in graduate school, her work has always been connected with silver bracelets. She is currently completing her dissertation on the subject, and in fact, she told me this morning that she has to have a draft in by April 1st, so she's a very busy woman. She's also planning on graduating with her PhD in June, this coming June, in the Department of Art History at the University of Washington. The title of her presentation today is Tlingit and Haida Silversmiths at the Turn of the 20th Century. Here's Katie Bunmore-Hughes.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here today. I'd like to thank Steve Herikson for putting all of this together, and to all the participants. It's been wonderful to hear from the elders and the artists and the academics. It's been a great occasion, I think. I'd also like to thank all the people who've shared their knowledge with me in this project. The silversmiths from the last century who've spoken across generations through their work, and the silversmiths of today who've been nice to look at the old pictures with me and chat about their work. And of course, I need to thank my advisor, Robin Wright, who's here today. And if anyone has information on objects that we see today or the artists that I discuss, I would love to know more about them. I'm currently writing my dissertation on 19th and early 20th century Northwest Coast jewelry, focusing primarily on gold and silver bracelets. And a brief review of the topics in my dissertation. I cover the early years of jewelry making and the development of silver and gold smithing techniques. And these are from the American Museum of Natural History and the Denver Art Museum. I'm also working on attribution of certain bracelets to a few late 19th century Haida artists. Also, the important role of bracelets in Kwakwaka'wakw potlatches, particularly the bride price repayment ceremonies. And lastly, the bracelets as important markers of familial, clan, and personal identity, both in the 19th century and today. And I was happy to find out the name of this weaver yesterday. And if you could see a very, very close-up of this slide, you'd see that she's not wearing this particular bracelet, but one that looks quite a lot like that. Today, however, I want to focus on one chapter of my dissertation, which examines the history of jewelry production in Alaska and northern British Columbia from the 1880s to the 1940s. This is a period often characterized as the dark years in Northwest Coast art history. For many years, Northwest Coast art historical accounts leapt from the late 19th century straight to the late 20th century, from Charles Edenshaw directly to Bill Reed, and ignored all artistic production in between. This is very true of jewelry histories that are written, and there's very few of those. 19th century jewelry, as well as all other art forms, was held up as the pinnacle of art making in a, quote, golden age, followed by an early 20th century decline and subsequent renaissance by a few key artists in the 1960s. I believe that disputing this modernist narrative is a critical part of current art historical inquiry, which strives to examine the legacy of cultural endurance rather than the deterioration of cultural practices. I question the long-held belief that Northwest Coast art production was in decline at the beginning of the 20th century. And as a case in point, I will examine here Haida and Tlingit jewelry production from the 1880s to the 1940s, focusing on the tourist economy in Alaska and northern British Columbia. I will juxtapose the discrepancies between anthropological reports about the scarcity of jewelers and the belief in the decline of art production, and the tourist, traveler, and Indian agent writings of the time. In so doing, I will illustrate the biases of anthropologists who consciously or otherwise discounted jewelry production for at least two reasons. First, they viewed jewelry's status as an acculturated art form, and second, they saw it as a manufactured tourist commodity, both of which determined its perceived authenticity in their eyes. The beliefs and biases of the anthropologists and collectors contrast sharply with the reality of the market economy during the first decades of Alaskan tourist travel. I will also discuss the techniques that artists use to produce and market their work to underscore the true availability of native-made jewelry, in contrast to the apparently false reports on the dearth of artistic production. The impression that art making in general, and jewelry production in particular, declined at the end of the 19th century is widely held and long-standing. As early as 1882, Emmons reported that there were only 4 silversmiths in Alaska at the time. And I'll show you later that that's clearly not true. In 1914, Thomas Deasy, who was collecting for what is now the Canadian Museum of Civilization, said, quote, "The Indians are giving up this kind of work, and only a few are making silver and gold bracelets. It was difficult to have one of them make the pair I am sending, and I had the Indian make them with the distinct Haida characters of years ago." Deasy's request for bracelets made with, quote, "characters of years ago," highlights an unspoken assumption that this is an older art form, no longer in practice. But ironically, he failed to appreciate that the artist he commissioned was fully able to produce these supposedly outdated artistic forms. In 1939, Arthur Moody told Barbeau that his father, Tom Moody, was the only one working in silver in Sitka at the time. Moody noted that, quote, "There used to be lots of good silver carvers, but now they're nearly all gone." But while interviewing Mrs. Walter Stevens, Barbeau was told that no one in the village was working in silver, no one in Skidegate was working in silver except for Charlie Gladstone. If Moody and Gladstone were working contemporaneously, one wonders who else might have been producing jewelry during those same years. The reason for this, for overlooking this fact is simple. Anthropologists overlooked the abilities of the artists of the time. Emmons' letters suggest that while he was aware that new bracelets were still being made in the 1940s, he deemed them to be not worthy of collecting. Barbeau concurred, suggesting that while there were still bracelets available to be purchased, he judged them to be of inferior quality. He wrote that, quote, "In any case, hardly any pieces are left for purchase now. Those made nowadays are not worth a collector's attention. There are plenty of them for sale in Prince Rupert." Indigenous artists knew that the tourist market offered a great number of patrons arriving at scheduled ports at designated times. Peter O'Reilly, Indian Reserve Commissioner of Victoria, described the thriving art industry in the Queen Charlottes in 1882. In describing Tanu, he wrote, quote, "These Indians are noted for their carvings both in slate and wood, and for their manufacture of silver ornaments, bracelets, and earrings, and I am informed that they realize as much as $600 to $700 per annum from this source alone." Even the local papers, of which Emmons must have been aware, reported on the prevalence of jewelry production. Additionally, travelers to the coast recorded that at every village had their own silversmith, and bracelets and rings were to be purchased at every port of call. Eliza Skidmore seemed to have found a silversmith in almost every location she stopped, including Tongass, Wrangell, Howcan, Kasan, Hoona, Metlakatla, and Sitka. By my own calculations, there were at least 34 Tlingit silversmiths working at the end of the 20th century in Alaska, and if anybody knows more people, and I know Evelyn knows, I have a question for you about the next slide. So 34 Tlingit silversmiths, 5 Kaigani Haida silversmiths in Alaska in the late 19th century. And thanks to the very hard work of Peter Corey and Elaine Schuler, they actually researched quite a few of these names. In fact, I think all of them have come up in their research. And I'd like to say, Peter told me this morning that it is Johnny Kasank, not Jim or James. And here, Evelyn, do you know the first name of Alfred Adams' father? But the father of Alfred Adams was Alfred Sr.? I have uncovered, along with, with Peter and Irene's research, the names of 101 smiths along the northwest coast in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So these are the Haida ones. We saw the Tlingit list. And just to complete the northern northwest coast, the Kaigani, Nishka, and Tsimshan smiths that I've currently found out about. And I'm sure there are more out there. While population numbers suggest that the cataclysmic effects of disease on indigenous populations, the number of Tlingit artists alone is a testament to both the importance of art to the culture and the economic opportunities afforded by the tourist trade. In fact, the economy of Alaska was heavily dependent on tourism industry, and especially on the production of Alaskan native curios. The 1890 census report estimated that in Sitka, quote, the white town is supported chiefly by the trade of Sitka and Yakutat natives, unquote. And the number of tourists visiting Southeast Alaska grew consistently throughout the late 1880s. Between 1885, and 1890, the federal government estimated that each tourist spent between $50 and $100 on curios. This added up to between $1.25 and $2.5 million over those 6 years. And if you think about the purchase price of Alaska being $7.2 million, that's just a huge comparison of the amount of money that's coming in through the tourist trade. The newspaper, The Alaskan, recorded the prolific trade in jewelry in an article from December 1885. They wrote, quote, a person has only to make a trip among these islands and visit the villages of the natives to see all kinds of carvings, from the tall totems that stand in front of the houses of the many wealthy, down to the finer workmanship in silver and gold displayed on earrings, finger rings, bracelets, blanket pins, etc. The Haidas have the reputation of furnishing the finest workmen, but there is not a village in the entire archipelago but what can boast of several carvers of more or less skill, and every village can boast of several carvers who make their living chiefly by making silver jewelry. The Alaskan also reported on the supposed importation of non-native manufactured jewelry from the States and denied that fakes were a part of the tourist market, but I'll show you in a moment that they were. Some artists used their fear of fakery to their advantage. The Tlingit artist Rudolph Walton's advertisements in the North Star focused on providing not only native-made goods, but a personal interaction with the artist. His newspaper ad encouraged customers to patronize Walton directly. It said, the ad said, quote, we can state that he is thoroughly reliable and deserves patronage. Gold and silver rings and bracelets are on hand and made to order. All of the engraving is done by himself. And should you visit Sitka, you will enjoy visiting his workshop. We can assure you, you will get a courteous reception as Rudolph speaks English well, unquote. Still, the reality of the situation in Alaska was not as simple as authentic versus fake. There were many levels of authenticity to choose from, whether the buyer knew it or not. One could watch a silversmith make a bracelet starting with silver or gold coins, or silver work could be bought directly from the artist who had prepared a number of pieces for sale on steamer days. Stores owned by native artists competed directly with white-owned stores and had an edge over them by having the artist on hand. And the silversmith, Jim Williams, seen here, and his wife owned their own store, the Native Curio Shop in Skagway. Like anthropologists and professional collectors, tourists also bought jewelry directly from the person who was wearing the desired object. It's well known then, as now, that an object that had seen indigenous use would carry more value than one on display in the tourist stores. So wearing bracelets for sale, and this woman is wearing 3 or 4 on each arm, was an effective marketing tactic on the part of women traders, and Skidmore described this. She said, quote, Indian women crouched on the wharf with their wares spread before them, or wandered like shadows about the ship's deck, offering baskets and mats woven of the inner bark and roots of the cedar, and extending their arms, covered with silver bracelets, to the envious gaze of their white sisters. They are keen traders and sharp at bargaining, and no white man outwits these women. Quote, unquote. White-owned stores also employed native artists to carve on order, and their participation was strategically marketed to promote these stores. The Besselson and Proul store in Ketchikan advertised, quote, genuine Indian silver bracelets and spoons made by Mr. Mather, a Metlakatla Indian who was with Father Duncan when he first brought his Indians to Alaska, unquote. At the P.E. Kern Native Curio Workshop in Skagway, Peter Kern hired native artists to make souvenirs, including gold, copper, and silver jewelry for the gold miners and the tourists who followed in their wake. The curio store in Kasan hired Chief Sunahat to produce silver rings, and one writer wrote, quote, "The fellows at Kasan keep him so busy that filling their orders, he never had much left over to sell to the tourists when they came on the boat," unquote. Despite contemporary writings that describe the proliferation of jewelry and other arts on the Northwest Coast, anthropologists continually deprecated the current conditions of production. Evidence from most every village shows that Emmons greatly underestimated the number of silversmiths in Alaska at the time. As I will show, these gross misunderstandings of the situation are typical of anthropological assumptions of the time and reveal a bias against art made for the tourist trade. So why not tourist art? These comments of Emmons and Barbeau suggest a contemporary collector's bias to reject artworks that did not conform to certain preconceived standards of authenticity. Their standards were primarily grounded in the late 19th century anthropological value judgments. Anthropologists sorted artists and their productions hierarchically, seeking out artworks that fit Western conceptualizations of authenticity and tradition. And these judgments led collectors to exclude artwork influenced by European materials and practices, such as silver and gold jewelry and spoons, button blankets, and beaded items. And I just wanted to point out, this is one of the few images where you can actually see the bracelets for sale, and they're just hooked over the edge of that basket at the bottom. Moreover, in the Victorian world, jewelry was part of the feminine realm, and as such, professional male anthropologists generally ignored jewelry to focus instead on artwork that fit within the Western categories of the great arts, painting, and sculpture. The bracelet, as a feminine accessory, was acknowledged, if at all, only in passing, as an aside, in anthropological investigations into more worthy topics, such as ceremonialism, kinship identification, or technology. A third anthropological strike against Northwest Coast artists was that they were producing for the tourist trade, creating art that would appeal to tourist tastes and needs, things that were small, portable, easily collectible. In addition, their wares were plentiful and widely available. And as Ruth Phillips has noted for the northeastern United States and Canada, availability and reproducibility, objects in multiples, were key for tourist sales, but could empty, quote, she says, quote, "empty the object of value for the rare art collector," unquote. Emmons and Barbeau desired objects that met their subjective criteria for authenticity. In searching for, this is what Emmons wrote, quote, "the first bracelets, wide ones for native use," unquote, he states his opposition to miniaturization and art made for sale. Many stores offered a combination of native-made and manufactured objects. Catalogs from Herman Kermsey's shop in Juneau reveal both locally engraved spoons and bracelets and stamped versions, made usually in Washington State, but in other places too, produced between 1900 and 1910. In the 1920s, Kermsey hired, I just said 1900 and 1910 because that is where I have this catalog page, dates from those times. But in the 20s, Kermsey also hired Jim Williams to engrave the handles of manufactured spoons, and this is one of those spoons by Jim Williams. Charlie Gunnock, a Tlingit artist from Cake, was also supplying Kermsey's store as well with spoons and bracelets. And a letter from 1916 records Kermsey's order to Gunnock for the engraving of 24 stock spoons and a dozen sheet silver bracelets. So he was giving Gunnock the spoons and the bracelet blanks, and then Gunnock was doing the engraving. These sources demonstrate another reason anthropologists may have discounted contemporary artwork. There was manufactured jewelry widely available, and sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. A 1910 invoice from the Seattle production company of Joseph Mayer and Brothers records that Kermsey was ordering from Mayer Brothers 11 lots of Indian spoons and 11 lots of Indian bracelets, all stamped productions. While Emmons despaired of jewelry quality and its associations with the tourist trade, he did actually collect nearly 80 silver, gold, and copper bracelets for Canadian and American museums. His notes for 8 of the 45 silver bracelets even specify their use within the culture as, quote, "a woman's ornament," some described as for general use, and others described as, quote, "worn by women of the highest caste at all times," or "worn by women of the highest class, both as ornament and as totemic mark." He identifies 3 bracelets as being specifically of the tourist trade, of the ones he collected. Despite his assertions that few artists had knowledge of jewelry making, he noted an overwhelming market for their products. And as the tourist trade grew, he recorded that silversmiths could not keep up with demand. He writes, bracelets, quote, simply were exhausted, except in the outlying villages between 88 and 98 when the white tourists came. He writes that a narrower, more quickly produced bracelet of this type was developed to meet the market demands. His collection notes read, quote, these very narrow bangle-type bracelets were made by Tlingit smiths at Wrangell and Sitka in 1880 for the tourist trade then just beginning. The wider native-type bracelets took too long to make to keep the trade supplied, unquote. Emmons did collect narrow bracelets, some with floral designs, which he ascribed to being copied from European design. And according to Emmons, the bracelet here, which is also this one, was, quote, of the narrow type first made about 1880 for the tourist trade. Emmons collected his earliest floral and silver bracelets in 1885, and these designs were still being regularly produced over 50 years later when he wrote, quote, those made by them today are newer, often in scroll work, unquote. And while he decried the influence of Euro-American design motifs, he also acknowledged that floral designs were worn by Tlingit women themselves. And my research shows that these floral designs were very much in demand by native customers. I hesitate to categorize bracelets as, quote, made for sale or made for use within the community, because these terms suggest fixed categories, whereas in all probability, any such categories were probably extremely fluid, existing, if at all, only at the moment of transfer from artist to new owner. I think there was actually a single unitary art market with a high degree of connoisseurship and artistic variability, just as there is today. Having already established Emmons' bias against tourist art, one can surmise that he sought authentic jewelry made for native community members. However, there's a great overlap in style and motifs among the bracelets that Emmons collected for his museums and the descriptions of bracelets purchased by tourists, such as those collected by Eliza Skidmore, and this is a drawing of bracelets she saw on her trip, and then bracelets that Emmons collected, so you can see they're all of the same type. I would argue that many bracelets made for sale were indistinguishable in type and style for those made for use within the community. In fact, both types were popular with tourists and with native customers at the same time. The silver bracelets for sale through the old Curiosity Shop catalogs in Seattle were implied to be of Haida manufacture, but were actually commercially made. And these are two of those types. And this is probably a design by Billy Wilson, here on the left, who was a Tlingit artist of the time. The company, Meyer and Company, which originated in Skagway and then moved down to Seattle, had thousands of hand-carved dies for miniatures, miniature stamp poles, and also other kinds of bracelet designs that they originally commissioned from native artists and produced stamp designs from those dies. This slide shows the stamp designs, the first here in its unbent form. This is a hand-carved, probably prototype of that same design by Jim Jacobs, Jim the jeweler. This is an early 20th century unbent model, and this is, on the left, a current production. You can still go online right now and buy this design from the company that now owns the dies that Meyer and Company originally commissioned. So in conclusion, this chapter examined the biases of turn-of-the-century anthropologists against the arts of acculturation and tourist art in general, and indifference to jewelry outside of its role in established avenues of anthropological inquiry. Their claims that no, quote, good old, unquote, work was being made, or that native artists were giving up precious metal jewelry making are wrong and are disproved by the reality of the tourist market at the time. Native artists and their products were of central importance to the Alaskan economy, attracting tourists and their dollars to the new American territory. Scholars of the period had cultural biases that influenced their subjective perception of authenticity and caused them to overlook contemporary artworks and their functions and values. Questions of authenticity that may have appeared stark to scholars of the period were in fact quite nuanced. A range of products, all indigenously inspired, if not actually native made, existed for purchase, from the handmade to the mass production piece. And a trip downtown today, or even probably a look at the jewelry that's in this room right now, and I know there's a lot of it, will reveal that the market for Northwest Coast silver and gold jewelry was just as strong and just as varied then as it is today. Thank you.
Okay. Well, our last final speaker of this session is Robin Wright, who probably doesn't need much of an introduction for most of you, but she is the curator of Native American art at the Burke Museum in Seattle. She's also the director of the Bill Holm Center for the Study of Northwest Coast Art, as well as professor of art history at the University of Washington. I just wanted to acknowledge that my very first trip to Alaska was with Robin, and it seems highly appropriate that this being my very first I also traveled here with Robin, and I've really enjoyed spending some time with her up here. The subject of her presentation is the Kiks.adi Haida house models, which will also be the subject of a traveling exhibition that will, I believe, be at the Burke Museum, the Field Museum, and at Haida Gwaii in Kiks.adi. And she has always been generous with sharing her knowledge with me, and she will now share her knowledge on this subject with all of us here today. Here's Robin Wright.
I'd just like to say gunas cheese to our hosts, and thank you especially to Steve Henriksen for organizing and inviting us up here. It's been a wonderful occasion for sharing knowledge. I know we're running a bit late, and I'm going to try and do this quickly. I did give a little version of this at Celebration in Juneau last June, and we've made some bit of progress since then. So I thought what I would do today is just focus on what we've been able to do between last June and now. This is a project that I got started on about 6 years ago after working on the research for a book called Northern Haida Master Carvers, which involved studying the works of art produced by members of the Edenshaw family, and in particular John Robson, who was the stepfather of Charles Edenshaw. And in order to get information about John Robson, just got into the archives at the Field Museum, looking at the list of model houses that were made by a group of artists for the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. And when I finished that book, I realized there was a huge potential for further research on this complete set of house models. And so that's what started me off, and I'm sure this is going to occupy me for the rest of my working career, because it's involving genealogies for most of the families in Kiks.adi and Haida Gwaii as a whole. So many of you are familiar with the photograph on the top, which has been published in a number of sources. And what I realized when I got into the records kept by James Deans and at the Field Museum is that this shows only a portion of the houses. There were 29 model houses. They're big, 3 feet by 3 feet by 4 to 5 foot tall model poles in front. This photograph only goes about halfway down the village. And so anyway, I just want to acknowledge, and I really regret that the rest of the Haida team that I'm working with couldn't be here with us today, but I wanted to bring in their pictures so you could see that it's a very exciting collaborative project. We're working together with the Haida Gwaii Museum at Kailnagai, and Nika Collison, who's a curator there, and Irene Mills are shown here in the storeroom at the Field Museum. It's probably a good thing Nika's not here. It's not the most flattering picture of her, but it does show, give you a sense of the scale of these model houses that are quite large and take up quite a bit of the shelf space. Also, Capt Gold, Wanigan, Richard Wilson is an elder who I've had the privilege of working with ever since my first trip to Haida Gwaii in 1979. And he's a wealth of knowledge about genealogy, and I'm very happy to be working with him. And the other people pictured here are Haida elders and very knowledgeable people in the village of Kiks.adi, chiefs among them. And we've bought a digital camera, and last September we were able to go up and film some interviews with 6 of these people, and I don't have time to play all of those. I actually was so impressed with Donna Folk's presentation on the first day with her little embedded videos in her PowerPoint that she took up at Celebration, that I spent the last 3 days kind of embedding some video in this PowerPoint presentation. So I'll play some of these so that some of these wonderful Haida people could be with us today. Another collaborator, a very useful member of our team, is Andrew Whiteman, and I always tend to take a picture of his back instead of his front, but he came with us on several trips, May, July, and September last year, to Haida Gwaii and to Chicago, and photographed with us. This is the Kailnagai Center that's newly built. They've been working, putting up the buildings behind the 6 poles that were raised in 2001. This is the old site of the village of Kailnagai, and it will open, I think, to the public in June. They've already raised some old poles in the museum part of this complex. It's a spectacular site, and this is where we hope that our exhibit will open in 2010, pending funding. So we're in the process of writing an implementation grant. We were funded on a planning grant for the last year. So we, with Andrew's help and Captain Gold's help, we've tried to match the exact spot on the beach where some of these old photographs were taken of Skidegate. And here we think we've found the spot on the beach where George Dawson took one of the first photographs ever taken in Skidegate in 1878. The village today has some changes to the shoreline with a big breakwater and big rocks that have been put in on both ends of the beach, but you can see the curve of the beach and the skyline. It's the same as it was in 1878. Of course, this goes back also to 1893 in Chicago, and we'll be looking at some of the writings of the people who were responsible for putting together the anthropology exhibit for the World's Fair. Frederick Ward Putnam was in charge of the anthropology building. He hired Franz Boas, and Franz Boas in turn hired James Deans to go to Haida Gwaii and collect this set of Haida houses. The World's Fair was a grand place with these huge classical buildings and sculptures, but the anthropology building opened late and was stuck way down at the end of the fairgrounds next to the stockyards. It didn't look very spectacular at all, but we were able, with the help of Google Earth, to compare the map of Chicago then and the World's Fairgrounds, and we went out and found the exact spot where the anthropology building was, and it's now a golf course. We think that's the same angle. And there's the map of the World's Fairground. The red block at the bottom is where the anthropology building was, and right out in front of that was a little pond. And the pond is still there. It's got a marina, and that curve of the beach is where that big Haida canoe was pulled up on the beach, and you can see outside of the anthropology building they had 2 full-size houses. The one on the far left is the Tom Stevens house from Skidegate, which was brought, the complete house, the pole of which now stands in the foyer of the Field Museum. This is James Deans and his little Tam. He was quite a character, a Scottish guy who was a former Hudson Bay Company employee. So we started with this photo, with this raking angle of the houses, and very early in the research I was able to locate another photo that had never been published. It's the one on the bottom that shows the center section of the village and gives us an idea. Well, this one was key in that we were able to confirm that a model pole that's now in Vienna, right there, was actually part of this installation. And there's a picture that's still missing. If anybody has seen a picture of the right-hand end of the village, we're looking for that section, and you can see the numbers of the houses and their names, and we'd love to find that picture as well. It may not exist, but we're looking for it. There were 3 houses that were actually somewhere in the fair, but not in that row of houses. They're shown down on the end. And going quickly here. We found this one at the Peabody Harvard Archives in the Putnam Archives that shows the extreme right end of the village. Looking down, you can see the 2 houses that were at the end, Copper House and Cogwint House. And then around the other side, this is the only photo I could find of another section of little model houses, and you can see one tall frontal pole. That may be the pole of Skungwai that went to Vienna as well. But so I'm searching for more historical photos, and anyone who knows about photo archives, if you have seen anything like that, let me know. James Deans did a sketch of the village and numbered all the houses as an aid to helping Boaz to install the houses. He also went to Chicago. Some of the houses are from other villages, these over here. I don't have time to go into all the detail. I just want to give you a sense of the complex nature of our research. We're lining up photos of the old village with the contemporary village to try and find the exact spots where the poles stood. We're looking at Newcomb's notes, where he was looking at this actual photograph and sketching and getting information from people in 1901 in the village and his lists of houses. We're looking at Swanton's lists of houses, trying to line them up. Of course, they're all numbered differently and named differently, and it's very complicated to try and figure out for sure which house is which. This is MacDonald's map of the village of Skidegate, showing his numbering of the houses and his names of the houses, which are drawn largely from Swanton and Newcomb's notes. And in red are the model houses names that Dean's recorded with lines. And you can see that we haven't figured this out totally. There's some model houses like Mountain House that could either be 26 or 13. We're not sure. Rainbow or Wolf House could be 27 or 24. There are several houses listed up in the corner that we can't figure out which houses they're models of. So it's an ongoing process, and it's quite a complex undertaking. So here we are, and I'm only going to give you a couple case studies. Captain Gold, since he's been the one that I've worked with the longest, I thought we could start with him. And Captain Gold's house, you've probably seen this photo of the fully painted house front and the moon mortuary disc up above, photographed in 1884 by Richard Maynard. And this is the present Captain Gold. And
hello, Robin. My name is Captain Gold of the Naikungigawa clan, which is from Rose Pit area, and I have the English name Richard Wilson. And over the years, I received the name Wanigan from my father's mother in the past, and that is my name until my mother's brother passed away, and then I got Captain Gold from him, plus two other names, Kana Ewens and Nun Kilslath, which is like Nun Kilslath is the name of Raven during the time of creation, and Skana Ewens is like great supernatural being or something like that. The Captain Gold, the first Captain Gold, has a recorded name in one of Haida monumental art books, dealing with Kaisuan or dealing with Jalt at the time. So he'd be the first Captain Gold, which come about in the 1851 time period. And then the second Captain Gold was a nephew of that first one. And he came from the area of First Beats, where Pearl Pearson's house is right now. And he moved out to join the first Captain Gold out in Kaisuan. And then he passed on shortly after that contact. And when he passed on, the nephew was very young. But my family was living with the group out near that Kaisuan area, and joined them on the final moves after smallpox into Jalt and then into Skidegate.
one of the intriguing things about this model of Captain Gold's house is that it has the name Zacharias. It was made by Zacharias, according to James Deans. And there are 17 names of artists associated with these 29 model houses. So part of what we're trying to do is figure out who the artists were. Some of them are well known, like John Robson and John Cross, but others, like Zacharias, we haven't known anything about. Well, we, thanks to the work of Bill Holm, think that the house front was painted by an artist that is known only by the name, the master of the Chicago settee. And those of you who know about attribution of Haida artists' work will have read Bill's book, Will the Real Charles Edenshaw Please Stand Up?, where he differentiates the work of 6 or 7 artists, one of whom is the master of the Chicago settee. Well, it's been one of my lifetime goals to figure out what his Haida name really is. And I don't know if this is it, but I think we're getting much closer to maybe being able to say who he was. And Bill Holm is of the opinion, and I guess I agree, that whoever painted that house model may have very well been the same artist, which would mean that that artist is Zacharias. So then the question is, who is Zacharias? And in the baptismal records and the census records, there is a man named Zacharias Nicholas. And I don't have time to play Capt Gold's video, but he, through his genealogy work, has identified Zacharias Nicholas as being a raven from Skungwai. And we were very thrilled to find that Percy Williams actually remembered the man Zacharias Nicholas, and I want to play his little clip.
Zacharias Nicholas is the name I used to hear all the time. I'm surprised there was nobody named after him. Such a beautiful name, important name. Even without meeting him or hearing about him, I feel he was a very important man. Zacharias, I like that name.
So there was only one Zacharias Nicholas. So I still want to work on this a little more, but I think it's really exciting for those of us who have done work on attribution using only descriptive names to suddenly be able to put the works of art with the real people and have the memory of those people. He goes on in the longer interview to say he remembered that Zacharias lived to be an old man. He liked to go out and hunt fish, and they found his body washed up on the beach by Slatechuck Creek. This is a model of Chief Skidegut's mortuary pole, also attributed to the master of the Chicago Settee, and may have also been made by Zacharias Nicholas. Barbara Wilson is the someone who has helped us with the research on the Kamshawa houses. There are a number of Kamshawa houses in the village of Skidigut. This one is Owl House. There's only a one corner post figure, an owl, that survives in the Brooklyn Museum. A number of houses were given to the Brooklyn Museum by the Field Museum, and all but parts of 3 of them are missing now. And Barbara, I don't have time to play her whole interview, but she was very helpful in working with us on this project. And well, maybe I'll just play a little.
My Haida name is Kiks.adi. My English name is Barbara Wilson. I'm the eldest sister of the next in line to be Chief Kamshawa. And as the eldest sister, I'm actually his only sister. And I only have a cousin. She's my second cousin. And her and I are the last females our age, like we're the matriarchs of our clan. And so we, this education I talk about, it extends to people my own age too, you know, because we grew up in a time when our parents told us to leave the old ways behind, to move on, because we had to survive in a white man's world. And so as I learn stuff, you know, I pass it on to my cousin, and she hopefully passes it on to her children, and I pass it on to mine and my brothers. And we spend a lot of time self-educating ourselves. And now here we are, you know, it's what, 20, 30 years later, and our kids dance, our women weave and make clothing, and our men carve and tell stories. And it's just like, it's like one of those, you know, how they talk about Snow White. Somebody kissed her. Somebody kissed the Haida Nation, and we woke up.
Wow.
That's what it's like, you know. I'm just, you know, I'm overwhelmed when I think of how grateful I am to those people who hung on to bits and pieces so that we could start putting the puzzle back together again.
And then finally, in the center of the village was this dugout house, which is the house of one of the Chief Skidiguts, and we were able to locate with several people's help, where that dugout, there were actually two dugout houses side by side right there, and it happens to be right in front of the house of Percy Williams, and we were able to interview both Percy and Ernie Wilson in the living room of the house where the arrow is there, and I'll play a little bit of that.
I'm Ernie Wilson, Chief Nish-West, Chief of the Skidans tribe. Yeah.
Very brief. My name is Percy Williams. That's it. Remember the two big holes that were here?
Yeah. One was right out front here.
And there was one over there.
Yeah.
Remember Charlie Gladstone built his house?
And it still had a pole in front.
Yeah.
Memorial pole. Or grave pole, yeah. That's the one.
This one?
Magnus's house right in the back there.
That was that one, huh?
Magnus Green?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can see the house there. And Uncle Sweet lived in the house next door. That's the one that was out here.
Yep.
Here's
Yep.
Magnus' house and Chennai Saul's old house.
Yep.
So that pole was just right out
Just
here.
over here.
Yeah.
About there.
Great.
That's that one.
That's it, right there. And the model of that house is the one that's in Vienna, and we hope to bring that back. And I just well, end with this one, with on unfortunately a sad note, in that I feel more and more the urgency of the work that we're doing, in that we were hoping to interview Billy Stevens, and he was out fishing the week we were there, and got the very sad news that he passed away suddenly in January. And when I was putting this talk together, I realized that I had put in to be added video clip from Billy Stevens, and we never got to do that filming. So I would just like to acknowledge Billy Stevens. He was a source of great knowledge, in particular about this house and the house of Daniel Elgewis. And fortunately, I did have a chance to interview him, not on tape, extensively in previous trips, and he shared a lot of knowledge about Daniel Elgewis and Josephine Elgewis, who is the grandmother of Bill Reed, and a lot of information about this house, Thunder and Lightning House, which is unfortunately missing. And so I'll just end my talk with a plea. There are still 14 of these models that are missing, and these are the pictures of them. You can go to our website at the Bill Holm Center, which is listed up at the top there. If you just Google on Bill Holm Center and click on the Skidegate House Model Project, there are bigger blow-ups of the 14 missing houses. We hope to find them. If we don't, we're planning to raise some money and commission contemporary carvers to carve the replacements for these, using the photos and the knowledge that's still there in the village. We're really excited about it. We hope we get some funding for it, and if so, there'll be a book and a website and a traveling exhibit, and we invite you all to come when it happens. How